Thanks very much. And I know that we're quite late in the afternoon, so I will try and move through pretty quickly. I guess, importantly, Don's given you a good background around my involvement in the trade and the industry over a period of time. I'll touch on that very briefly, talk a bit about China and market perspective. Troy's touched on some of those things, which is good, so we can skip most of that. But look at where are we now in terms of the live cattle trade, and particularly the feeder and sorter trade into China. What have we learned over the last 2 years, and where is the future? I'm a director of Food and Agribusiness Services Group. Apart from that, though, probably more importantly to talk about China, I've visited China probably about 65 times since 2003, and have spent a lot of time up there negotiating and delivering livestock, mostly around the breeding livestock markets, but more recently around the feeder and sorter trade. I've operated across the supply chain from production through to operating businesses in markets, including China, and I've been involved in the discussions around the feeder and sorter trade and protocol since 2006 when it first kicked off, so it took a long time to complete. And more recently been involved in the first shipment of sorter cattle in January, February by sea from Australia to China, and 2 of the 3 air shipments since we signed off on the protocol in 2015. So a very brief piece on the market perspective of China. World's largest population, second or largest economy, depending on upon how you define it, but it's still growing and still growing quite well. By 2030, it's predicted that 56% of the population will have incomes in the middle class, and their definition of middle class income ranges between about $20,000 US to $40,000 US per household. We know at levels above $30,000 per household US, there's a massive change in the amount and type of protein consumed, and particularly in relation to red meat. The Belt and Road strategy that's been highly promoted in China and elsewhere is really targeted at directly connecting China for trade, investment and resultant relationships, including political, to over 70 non-traditional partners. And it's estimated that China will invest over over $4 trillion US between now and 2030 to facilitate this. So the reality, the influence of China around global trade and trade within our region is going to continue, and it's going to be significant. As Troy said, it's not just one market. It's a series of regionalised and provincial markets, each with their own different culture, dialect and cuisine. And that's really important when you're trying to produce and process and position a product in that marketplace. There are, in my view, there's significant potential around China, and many people have spoken about this over a long time, but there's still many elements that need to be refined, developed, and better understood from both sides. I wanted to touch on some key trends impacting premium food in China, and that's a pretty busy slide, but it boils down to the fact that there are some mega trends. But it's important to remember that not all consumers in China either want or can afford premium products, including beef. But those who can focus on safety, provenance and where it comes from, the sustainability and traceability, health, nutrition, and the fact that it's a natural product. The social aspects and status, particularly in China, continue to influence buying behaviours. And then, as Troy spoke about, the use of technology, innovation, and the ease of purchasing a product. And I think that's going to continue to have more and more influence around how products are purchased and positioned. Of course, though, some other of the market segments are going to be dominated and focused around affordability, and they will be commoditised segments and commoditised products. When we look at, and this comes from some work that MLA did in 2016 around buying priorities and consumer data taken in China from 5 of the largest cities in China. And what do people look at and what influences their buying behaviour on packaged beef? There is priorities around naturalness, freshness, origins and brand, and particularly around date of production. So I think one of the things that imported live cattle can do, particularly where they're processed in high quality facilities with a strong focus on food safety, integrity, they can deliver those key attributes around natural production, naturalness of the animal, freshness, provenance, brand and date package. And that's important around where this industry may play a role in that particular market. So where are we at? There's been a long relationship with China in terms of live exports since 2003, effectively in real commercial volumes around breeding stock for dairy, beef and sheep. We now have an active and agreed protocol that was agreed in 2015 after many years of work. There was an old protocol, it just wasn't efficient, wasn't effective and it wasn't commercial. But less than 5,000 cattle have been shipped to date, including those 2 vessels on the water as we sit here today. So things around pricing of cattle and the costs of getting there, cost of protocol, the commerciality of the protocol, and really a lack of clear market signals from the marketplace around what it wants, what breed, what market segment are they going to, and what quality relationship do they want, has probably held the opportunity back to date. Balancing the price between quality, or balancing the aspects between price and quality is always going to be a conundrum. The reality is people want the highest quality for the cheapest price, and that's never going to be any different. But we need to get that relative to the product that is looking to be produced and what the consumers want, and particularly where parts of that product might end up. I guess there's improving signs in China with domestic cattle price in the marketplace, so that's auguring well, and that's probably the reason why we're seeing a bit more activity start to happen, and a bit more activity planned. The one key message, so if I can leave you one for today, is if your business is not good at detail and your suppliers of livestock aren't committed to getting things right, then China just might not be the market for you. It is important to get the detail right, and it is important to comply with the requirements. We have a known supply chain process in place. There are multiple regulatory and compliance points throughout the supply chain, both pre-export and post-export. And if we think our side is difficult, the importing side on the China end is also difficult. Right? There are a number of regulations that need to be complied with. We're seeing significant investments on the Chinese side in relation to supply chain assets in feedlots, abattoirs, and more recently in shipping. So those things are being prepared in readiness for the trade to really start to move. The Chinese requirements require that animals essentially go through a closed loop process. So limited aspects around numbers or loading from one port to one discharge port into one supply chain in China. And so I think that protects greatly around the integrity of the supply chain and the ability to manage the supply chain. There is a lot of direct oversight and direct involvement from Chinese government officials in these facilities. So what have we learned? Attention to detail throughout the chain is absolutely required. There are prescriptive and detailed requirements, and understanding what is required at every inspection point is important. And effectively, whether you think it's necessary or not really doesn't matter. The expectation is that we comply with the regulations, and we comply with them every single time. We have to meet what's expected. Exceeding it once won't advance you up the ladder, but consistent compliance over time without fuss will build your reputation as a supplier and as a reliable supplier into that marketplace. Having clear systems that are easy to understand, both from a regulatory point of view here in Australia and a regulatory point of view in China, is a significant advantage. And being able to repeat those systems time after time after time without issues is quite important. We've also seen the need for significant planning, training, and the development of operational partnerships to ensure the smooth development and execution of supply chains. We need to manage the critical control points and adapt them to suit. So, for example, around some of these are things like design of infrastructure, handling facilities, and all of those sorts of things that comply with local regulations, comply with OIE requirements, are not necessarily always designed with significant influence from Australia. And it's only once you put Australian livestock through those systems that there's a recognition of the need to change them to accommodate. So it's about continual review, continual adjustment, and making sure things work well. There are numerous ways to getting the same outcome. And because it's different to the way we do it here doesn't mean that it's wrong, it's just different. So one of the experiences through the first shipment was an inherent propensity to want to bone the carcasses out on the table, whereas we are much more familiar and much more adapted around rail boning. And that's all because of the types of cuts and how much they denude the cuts and how much fat that they trim off the cuts to put it into the marketplace to meet what's expected from the consumer. One of the other interesting aspects is Australia exports large volumes of bone-in rib meat to China, huge volumes, which after arrival are then reprocessed, deboned prior to sale, into a form that consumers want. It's slow and laborious and would be cost ineffective to do that in Australia, but it still needs to occur in the marketplace. I think the one key part around the China feeder and slaughter trade that we all need to understand is that as soon as an animal starts to head towards that supply chain, we need to ensure that we're feeding and managing for efficient production all the way through. There's not enough time in the supply chain if you've got 14 days after slaughter cattle arrive to get those animals back on track. And nor is there enough time if you're putting feeder animals into the marketplace where you've probably got on average 60 to 75 days of feeding. If they don't go into that marketplace and get onto the ration straight away, or there's an issue and they go off their feed for 7 to 10 days, there's no chance of picking up that lost production. So it's really important that we structure the process and get it right all the way through the supply chain. There are a couple of recent developments that I'd just like to touch on. Obviously, the recent announcement of the sheep protocol is opportunity to harmonise some of those, some of those benefits realised in that sheep protocol across to the cattle protocol. And particularly in there, I'm talking about the removal of the all-in, all-out approach, which said, you can only have one shipment of livestock in a pre-export facility at a time, no other livestock for other countries, and once you take them out, then we want it spelled for a period of time. That now says that you can have multiple shipments of livestock in a registered premise being prepared as long as the Chinese cattle are segregated and separated. The Chinese sheep are separated and segregated from other animals. So that creates a significant benefit in terms of efficiency around how we use our facilities. Things like daily inspections and sensible dust mitigation requirements. There are other areas within the protocol that still continue to need more work over time. And I think there's further investment and development resulting at the moment around people positioning and organisations positioning themselves and securing capacity for the future. So what about the future? My view is that China is a market of significant potential, but there is still some way to go, commercially, operationally, and from a regulatory point of view. There will need to be greater linkages to be created throughout the supply chain. There will need to be development of clear customer channels, targeted products, brands, and the segmentation within particular regional markets around where those products from the animals will go and at what point and in what form. There does need to be further refinements to reduce the costs in the protocols and the additional requirements without impacting biosecurity. I think that's a really important point. Whatever changes we seek cannot impact the biosecurity nature, the biosecurity of that protocol. So things around slaughter periods after arrival, the registered premise distance from port, footbathing, and multiple consignees will eventually add more efficiency and more profitability through the process. The commerciality of the trade needs to be right. The regulatory processes need to be right, efficient and effective on both sides. And the operational delivery needs to be accurate to be able to grow and deliver on the opportunity that this market represents. So thank you. I hope that's given you a little bit of insight into the China feeder and slaughter trade. I'm around for the next couple of days, so if you want to get into more detail around how things work and those sorts of things, happy to discuss that with you. Thanks very much.